There we go. I think we are now live on YouTube. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us here today for the Friday webinar. We've had a couple of weeks off, so it's nice to be back and meeting with everyone. We've got a very large group here to listen to Dr. Elaine Keillor talk to us about classical performance practice in the keyboard. And she's playing and going to be demonstrating from her forte piano. Some of you might remember that she was with us a couple of years ago, and I'll show you in a moment where to find that so you can look back at some of the webinars she gave previously using this format. It was quite exciting, and they remain some of our most watched webinars to date. I've got a couple of things I want to give you an update on. First of all, our June exam session, which is our largest exam session of the year outside of the flex exams, is scheduled for June, and we've got 20 centers listed now. We've just recently added Whitby, Ontario, and Georgetown, Ontario back to the list because some teachers are reaching out to us and say, I think we have enough students to run a center, and we talk about it. We look at the likelihood that that can happen. So those of you that are registering for June exams, these are exams that are held in person with regional examiners in your center. You can register for the nearest center. Otherwise, you have to use the flex option, which is for online exams only. And the deadline, just to note there, is March 14th. So in 2 weeks' time, we close registration, and then we start organizing that June session. Now, we've learned that most of you, though, I think 62% of students last year preferred the online option, flex option, and of course, just keep those registrations coming in. Allow 2 weeks minimum for now. And I'd say once May kicks in, please allow 3 weeks. And if the exam is going to be in June on a flex basis, get your students to register 4 weeks in advance to make sure that you get the date that they're asking for. In terms of the webinars next week, I want to have a little discussion, and I'm sure most of you saw your inbox. I tried to describe what I was thinking. These whole webinars started during the pandemic when we were trying to get teachers online, teaching through Zoom and holding sessions to get them familiar with how to do that. And a lot of you probably were there when we walked through that and got teachers working with students still on Zoom while we were all in lockdown. And part of that was for me to have a big roundtable discussion. I think that's what sort of spawned this whole webinar series is meeting with you all and having discussions. And we haven't had an interactive discussion for a while, for a couple of years, I believe. So what I want to do next Friday, those of you that register and want to join me live on Zoom, we'll still meet in Zoom webinar like this, but I will promote your microphone, and I'd like to hear from a lot of you in terms of what you're experiencing currently in your studios. It's come to our attention through our teacher survey last year that many of you are finding things a bit different. And not only different than they were, let's say, 10 years ago when things changed for us a lot, but different even still since the pandemic. So I'd love to hear your ideas and thoughts about how you're succeeding in your studios now and what you've had to change, how you're finding students. We found some interesting data in the survey with well over 100 of you answering that survey. And so I'd like to chat with you a little bit about that, discuss some of the solutions that you're finding, maybe talk about some of the frustrations you might be seeing. And it'd be nice to check in with you. And I'll also talk a little bit about digital badges as an alternative to our exams, because we've noted for a long time now that there are fewer and fewer students taking exams all the time. So that's what's on tap for next week. Then we take 2 weeks off over March break for most of the country. And then on Friday, March 28th, we're going to have Dr. Erin Parks come back. She's also in Ottawa, teaching students with learning disabilities. And perhaps I'll just read out the description for that webinar here so that you can hear it. And I'll send this in an email to you starting next week. Learning disabilities, particularly dyslexia, which are challenges with reading and language, and dyscalculia, challenges with math, can lead to difficulties in the music learning process. Reading notes on a staff and rhythm processing can both be greatly impacted. Fortunately, there is a wealth of strategies that can be used to support students with learning disabilities. In this webinar, we'll explore the challenges that learning disabilities can present for music teachers, discuss strategies to support our students, and learn activities that can build skills in our students to add to our teaching toolkit. So that's what's on tap for March 28th. When I send an email out next week, I'll include that description as well as a link to that webinar so that you can register for that. A little update on mosaics. Elaine's going to be playing from the Mosaic series for us today, grades 1 to 4, and we have 1 to 4 out now. You can buy these at deborahwanlessmusic.com. And grade 5 we're working feverishly on, and I'm somewhat confident that we might have grade 5 ready for sale by the end of March, which would be really great. I know a lot of you have been waiting for grade 5. And like I've said before, we'll have more series where I'll play through the music for you just to introduce you to the music so you know what you're getting into should you want to buy and have your students work from those books. And as we get into the next level every time. I'm that much more excited about the repertoire that we're offering and the diversity that we can bring to the music and unearthing new music. So we're quite excited about that. And then that reminds me to talk about some edits. As Elaine has worked through these, she keeps finding little errors and things. So she's going to mention them. We're changing those. And we do small print runs so that if you don't have the books yet, likely the errors she talks about today, you'll find them corrected by the time you get the scores. But if you don't, take note of these little things and they'll be corrected over time in our scores. You'll see your students getting these books in time with them corrected. But they're just small things that are very difficult to detect sometimes. But Elaine has a very keen eye and a very keen ear for all of this music. And so she's going to bring up some of those things as she works through it. She also has a handout that she's prepared. I'm going to put a link to the handout in the chat box so that those of you here with me live in Zoom can download it. Those of you watching on YouTube, after the webinar is over and the replay becomes available a few minutes after, I'll have a link to the handout there in the YouTube description as well, so that you can download her handout and get her notes. I'll show you one more thing here. I'm just going to share my screen and go to the YouTube channel so you can see where these webinars are, because I think some of you will be very interested in Elaine's former webinars that she did back in 2022. Here I am at the homepage for Conservatory Canada TV. If I go to webinar replays, this is actually the playlist tab here. I click on the playlist tab. I go to webinar replays, view full playlist. That's in the top right there. I have to scroll down quite a way because this is a playlist that just has all the webinars in order that we've broadcast over the last 3 years or so. And if I go down here, right after Dr. Gilles Como is Dr. Elaine giving us the webinar on ornamentation from her grand piano. And then two below that, we have her talking about Muzio Clementi, where she's performing a Clementi sonatina from the forte piano that she's using today. It was a really great webinar. Both of these were very well viewed, and I think you'll find those quite interesting, in addition to what she's going to tell us today about classical performance practice. So Elaine, thanks for preparing all of this. And I know we're all eagerly looking forward to it. Thanks to all of you for watching on replay after the fact. Please spread this webinar and all these webinars out there to your colleagues so that more people can see them. Elaine, I'll turn this over to you. And just note, everyone, because we're trying to capture the sound of the forte piano today, Elaine's microphone has to be set a little bit on the softer side than we're used to. So sorry about that. If you have a way to amplify it, great. And those of you watching after the fact, sorry for that volume, but this is the only way through Zoom that we can hear the forte piano clearly and balance that off with her voice as well. Elaine, thanks for joining us. Go ahead and I'll turn it over to you now there. You can go ahead now, Elaine.
Okay, thank you very much, Derek, for the introduction, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in this great country of Canada. So if you have the handout in front of you, I am going to start with Mosaics 1. And at the top of each page of the handout, I have put the title, Classical versus Baroque. And I feel in my own teaching, I try to stress to students the importance of understanding each period. What is different when we talk about the music of a different historical period? And so when we look at Baroque pieces, one of the things that we find is that whatever the idiom, the gestures the composer has used for that piece, he or she tends to continue it. And of course, often Baroque music has been given the pejorative term as sewing machine music because it goes on and on and on and on. But something major happened between the Baroque and the classical period. And that was basically the influence of folk music. Now, folk songs had been used occasionally in the repertoire that we consider being part of the European classical music. But it became much more evident in the classical period. And so when we look at representation of music that is really based on folk material, and that's often dance material, such as in this German dance of Beethoven on page 11, we find so we have 2 4-bar phrases very clearly laid out there. And he continues with that idea in the B section, the binary form of this piece. And this idea of phrases being 4 bars long is one that we find constantly being used in the classical period. And so this was one of the big influences that we have. And I've also put on the handout references to videos that you can find on YouTube that I think it would be helpful for you to show to your students if they're using this piece. So for instance, the 12 Country Dances, Ruffs and Rees on page 16 by a black composer, Ignacio Sancho, which I'm very happy that Mosaics has included several works of his. But you can actually find on YouTube a video of this dance being performed. And again, when we look at this dance, 4 bar phrases. And in this case, we have 3 4 bar phrases. So as we go through these works today, I think you'll find that they're often organized into that 4 bar phrasing, which is very much a characteristic of the classical period. And one of the other things that I said was very typical of the Baroque period was the idea that we have some kind of gesture or idea introduced by the composer, and that is spun out over the whole composition. Whereas in the classical period, we find a variety of different things. These could be rhythmic, they could be melodic, and this gives much more variety. And the other thing that composers discovered in the classical period, particularly when they were working with this new instrument, the forte piano. And just as its name suggests, it can play both loud and soft. So instead of having more or less a standard dynamic throughout a Baroque piece, we are asked to use different dynamics in the composition. And even if they are not specifically written in, you should encourage your student to think about how they want to change it and make more variety. And particularly, I would say, when we have sort of the same material being used, maybe in a slightly different way, but we don't want to play it twice at the same dynamic level. We want some variation. So those, I think, are important points to keep stressing to students when they are dealing with classical repertoire. Now, the next thing that I did on this listing was I thought we had a lot of different titles, and I'm sure most of you are very familiar with these titles, but I thought maybe in some cases you're not quite as knowledgeable about where they might have come from. So I did put down a little list of things. So for instance, on page 6 of Mosaics 1, we have an arioso, which of course is referring to a combination of the aria from opera and the recitative from opera. So here by Turk, now I would suggest that the 2 little opening phrases are much more typical of recitative with the repeated notes, but this very melodic is more reminiscent to me of what one might find in an aria from an opera. So I think maybe that's why Turk decided to use that title. Another title that comes up is Bagatelle, and of course this comes up quite often. And it basically is referring to generally a short piece that can be rather light in nature and at the same time melodious. So James Hook has and here of course we have the contrast of dynamics written in specifically by Hook. So the first time forte, the second time piano. Etude, of course, is one that you're very, very familiar with, which of course is just a study that is written to assist in making a certain technical difficulty easier. In this one by Diabelli on page 9, what I find interesting is the introduction of the Alberti bass, which of course occurs very frequently in classical music, because in the classical period we have this emphasis on key. Remember that it was only at the beginning of the Baroque period that there was a distinction starting to be made between major and minor key. But because of the difficulty in finding a tuning that would work on this keyboard instrument, the forte piano, or of course the earlier keyboard instruments of harpsichord and so on, there was a limit on what keys one could use, because let's say take F sharp, there are other keys that you want that to function as a G flat, but the tuning that was used in the Baroque period, if it were a sharp, it would be tuned a little bit higher, and if it were a flat, it would be tuned a bit lower. So that prevented composers from moving readily from key to key. So as you know, in 1722, Bach wrote his first volume of the Well-Tempered Clavier, where he showed it was possible to write a composition in each of the major and minor keys that we know throughout the octave. And that made a huge difference, because then classical composers were able to sort of pit one key against another. And this became really the underlying feature of the main type of structures that were used in the classical period. Now, what keys they would use against one another, it was usually, of course, if they started off in C major, they would often go to G major, which is exactly what we have in this etude of Diabelli. He starts in C major, then he goes to G major. And then back to C major. So he's contrasting those two keys. And of course this, we've had Rameau come along in 1722, and he pointed out that the chords that composers were using, they would use, if we talk about C major, they would use mainly the tonic triad, and then they would use the dominant triad of that key, and then they would also use the subdominant. And those were the main chords. And of course, Rameau also argued that if we take that tonic triad and we invert it, that is really the same chord. Well, that was revolutionary, because in the Baroque period, those would have been considered three separate chords, three separate combinations. So again, the ability to shift from one key to another became much simpler, because a composer could use an inversion of one of those chords to get to another key. So those were major developments in how classical music evolved. Now, of course, in the classical period, we have a lot of things that carried over as well. And one of those, of course, was the idea of the minuet, which had become such an important dance at the court of the French court of King Louis. And so the minuet continued into the classical period, as we can see in this minuet by Leopold Mozart on page 17. And of course, as you know, the minuet is in 3/4 and it's very graceful. But I find in teaching the minuet, it's very important to give some idea of what the actual dance gestures were in the minuet, which was quite complex in a way. There was a great deal of, the body had to be balanced in a different way. The dancers had to sort of point their toes at certain points. And of course, there were bows that had to be done. And usually these bows occur at the cadences. So again, you look at a minuet and see where the cadences are. And I try to stress with my students that this has to be very graceful because the partners are bowing to one another. And so I have given you YouTube video, learn how to dance the minuet, which I think you might find helpful to show your students, to give them some idea of how this music accompanied the motions of the actual dance. And then one of the other terms that we have in the Mosaics 1 is romanza. Now this is a term that's been around for a long, long time, and it really comes from Spain originally, and it referred to one of the important Sephardic literatures. And it really was more a feeling. It had to be personal, it had to be very tender, but it didn't really have any strict formal arrangement. So we find romances of different types. Now I want to point out to you, I think the romance is on page 22, 23. This is one place where we do have some notes to change. So if you look at bar 18, if you have the book, the notes in the right hand should be A and B, not G and A as printed in this first edition. So if you can make that change, that will look after that. So in this romanza, we can hear how Steibelt has written short little phrases first, very lyrical. And then more extended. And again, you can hear the different characters there of the phrasing. We do have the two-note slur of the first 4 bars carried over to the next 4 bars, but then we have a whole series of them, and so on. And it's a much more extended phrase. And then, speaking about structure here, this is one where we have A sections and a B section contrasting, and then back to the A. And the 2 A sections from 9 to 16 and the last one are varied to a degree. Well, actually the last one is similar to the A1, the bar 9-1. So this is a frequent structure that we can find being used, and I find it's very important to point out these structures to students, particularly for memorization. I often find my students don't even recognize that 2 bars are the same as 2 bars that they had earlier in the piece. So I make an effort of really pointing out structure to them, because I think this helps them to understand the overall organization of the piece, and then when they come to memory work, I have to play those 2 bars again, sort of idea. So that's why I point them out. And I think these other structures are well known to you. I wrote down the binary structures, of course, where we have 2 sections, such as in page 11 and on page 12. And then we start to come into rounded binary as well. And of course, that means that we have, first of all, an A section. And that's more or less repeated with a different ending. Now we have a B section. And then A comes back, actually, as the second system. And then we also see the appearance of ternary structures. So both on page 16 and 17, we have ternary structures, which are normally A, B, A. Other little things that I find that perhaps might be of more difficulty for students to assist in getting correct is if we look to the Minuetto by Elisabetta de Gambarini on page 19. She uses regular eighths but then triplets. So I often find with students it's difficult to get them to switch from regular eighths to triplet eighths. So what I have them do is first of all we clap a lot or tap on the instrument, whatever, in one rhythm, the eighths, and do that several times. Then we do the same thing but using triplets. And we keep going over it and over it and over it. And I find that eventually they catch on. And of course, this is something that comes up frequently in later pieces. So let's turn now to the Mosaics 2. And in Mosaics 2, we have some more folk material, which I thought we would look at. Because here we actually have a German folk song on page 15, and this is, am I right here? Oh, guess I'm not right. Where's our horseback rider? Sorry, I must have written down the wrong, it's 13, I got one number wrong there, sorry. Page 13. Here, this is a typical formation of a German folk song. And I should also stress about this 4-bar phrases that I'm talking about. This is typical of Western European folk music. When we move a little bit more to the Eastern European side, we find much more varied structure. But for the Western part of Europe, most folk songs are organized in 4-bar phrases. So here in the horseback ride, we have the first 4 bars repeated for the second 4 bars. So here we have a little bit longer stretch, as you can hear. We also use a sequence, and this is another thing that I like to point out to my students because, again, it helps with memorization later on. So we have then the same idea down, a tone, and then he puts on this tune has another little addition, so it's a little bit longer phrase, but then we go back to the initial. So many German folk songs are constructed in that manner, that you have an A section that probably will appear 3 times, and then there can be a longer central section, slightly longer central section. So again, that can be an influence that we see in the structure of pieces that we find from the classical period. Now, dealing with the titles that we find in Mosaics 2, we have a title that comes up that we're going to see very frequently, and it is that of the Ländler, which is, of course, a German dance. And we have an example on page 17 of Beethoven. And I pointed out that Beethoven has put in a forzato on the first beat. And of course that is referring to, usually there's a big stamp of usually the male dancers at that point. And that's very much a characteristic of the Ländler. And it also occurs in the Haydn one that we have on page 8. And again, I list there a YouTube video that you can use that gives you some idea of how it is danced and how those special accents come in. I like to briefly look at the Haydn one on page 11 because it has this occurring in the 3rd bar. And what I would do here is encourage my students to put the thumb across both a G and A. And that's a technique that will come in very handy later on, particularly if you're dealing with smaller hands and they're just getting to the point that they can sort of cover an octave. So this would be a good place, I think, to apply that fingering here. And then we have the Polonaise, which of course comes from Poland. And of course, you know many famous polonaises by Chopin and other composers. So once again, I give you a YouTube video that you can go to see how it is actually danced. Once again, with our black composer, Ignatius Sancho, we have an actual dance video of his Bushy Park that can be watched on YouTube. And the écossaise is rather unusual. We don't exactly know why in the earth it got its name, but it probably originated in France, because écossaise is the French term for a Scottish woman. Now we probably have run into later écossaises that are more closely modeled on an écossaise, as it is at the country dance, as it's danced in Scotland, and has that type of rhythm. But you can see that in this Haisler écossaise, we do not have that rhythm. And so on. And once again, I give you a YouTube video for that. And we also have the fanfare in here. So I find sometimes with my students, they have no idea what a big regal trumpet is used for fanfares and so on and so forth. So I have given you a YouTube video that you can look up that gives you an idea of how a fanfare probably would be used for nobility. As for structure, again, we have lots of binary ones in the mosaics too, and you can start to see how we are edging towards sonata allegro structure. So if we go to page 5, you can see that the middle section here is much longer than the opening A section. So it is extended. And of course, here again, Diabelli makes a modulation in the B section going to D minor, and then he comes back to his original C major. So that idea of contrasting keys is here. And this was what classical composers started to play with. They placed one key in opposition to another key. And this is how they built tension, because really the sonata allegro structure is based on tension between two key areas. And it's very important, I find, with students to look at the keys that are being used and let them hear the contrast between one key and another. There's one other point I would just like to bring out about this piece. You can see that all the left-hand parts, these broken triads, they're phrased. Now, what I often find is my students tend to do this. They make it what I call a hiccup at the end. And I try to point out to them, it's just a very slight break. You don't make a big deal out of it. And of course, this comes up a great deal in classical repertoire. So if you can urge them early on to just make a gentle break, those left-hand patterns will come out much better. And I also pointed out another example where we're aging much closer to what will be the sonata allegro structure in this sonatina by Haslinger on page 24. So he gives us first in C major, introducing chromaticism, But what happens here? And now we have a nice little sort of chromatic thing coming back to our original, and we have a term here, dolce. So I made a little note at the bottom. This term, dolce, first appears in a work written by a composer that you probably have not heard of, an Alsatian composer by the name of Leonce Honar. And he used dolce for a portion of his secondary key area. Here, of course, it's at the beginning of what we would call the return of the A section. But what I would suggest, I think, is I looked through sonatas by Honar where he used dolce, and then, of course, it came up very frequently later on. I think you can vary this. I would suggest using a flatter finger here. So it's much more lyrical and sustained, like a voice line, in contradistinction to the opening. I think makes a nice contrast here. Just ornamentation. We have grace notes, which of course here on page 14 in the Atwood, these would be on the beat. And also on page 8, I think we have a grace note. Yes, and this is the Haydn. Now, it does have the little dash through it, so you can make it faster if you wish. It could also be that. But my tendency would be here, probably the faster interpretation, but that you can vary that. So now let's move on to Mosaics 3. And what I mentioned here in the classical versus Baroque, thinking about the classical versus Baroque period, is that we had a very important movement that happened in literature and that carried over into music, and to a certain degree also in pictorial art. And that movement is known as Sturm und Drang in German, which means storm and stress. And it really led to what we think of as more romantic ideas. The situation that a person does not stay in the same mood, let's say for a whole day. They can vary completely from being very sad at some points to being very happy and to being peaceful and so on. And of course, this all grew out of the ideas of Rousseau at the midpoint of the century, where among other things, he said that each man was important in his own right. That it didn't matter what class one was born into. Each man had something to offer to humanity. And that, of course, was a complete shift from what we had in the Baroque, where society was very clearly separated according to what class level you were in. And it was very difficult for a person to move from one class to another. So those ideas of Rousseau were very much a factor in the development of what we've considered classical expressions. And one of the other things that Rousseau did, because as you know, he was a musician as well, and he produced a Dictionnaire de musique as well as an opera, and he worshipped peasant culture. In his dictionary, he often puts in folk songs that he feels come from different areas, including he has one in from Canada. So with the Sturm und Drang period in the 1770s, we really start to have an idealization of peasant culture. So that means that we have more of the dances coming from different areas. being an influence in what kind of music was being produced. And one of the ones that occurs on the scene is that of the mazurka on page 32. And this is very clearly a ternary structure, ABA. But it goes. Now I would still do those. You could do them as 16ths or as 32nds, or either one, I would say. Because this change of where one places an ornament, whether it's on the beat or before the beat, the first treatise that we have that really says all musicians now are playing before the beat, and that came out in 1822. But we do know that not all musicians agreed with that idea. The Schumanns being important examples of that idea. And so there's a carryover of the idea of being on the beat, of course also with Chopin. So we have to consider, but here I would definitely think that this would be on the beat, and you could do it either way very quickly, or you could do it as even 30 seconds. We also have, on the last system here, we have with the RF, the Rundforzando, and what I want to stand, and I'm very glad how this was edited in the Mosaics edition, because they point out that that E has to come up. So a Rundforzando in this period did not apply just to one note. It incorporated usually 3 notes, or sometimes even more, that should be stressed. And we also have, with that Rundforzando, we have an arpeggio. Now again, I would play that arpeggio on the beat, and so on. From Mazurka, we have the Vivace, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, on page 26, which just really, it refers more to the character that I think Haydn wants here. So very playful and lively. Now, scherzo is an interesting term because it was first used actually in the Baroque period, and it was used for vocal works by Monteverdi in 1607. But it didn't pass over into a lot of other music until we get into the classical period. So here we have an example on page 24 of a scherzo by von Weber. And I would say that the term, of course, comes from Italian. It means jest. So what I usually look for is there's probably a surprise someplace. And I think here it is, it's that. We don't expect that chord there because it's really a 2/7. So it's quite unusual. So I would encourage students to really bring that out in this piece, to give that idea of a little bit of a joke. Now, another dance that became very, very popular in this period was the polka. And we have a polka example on page 44 by Glinka. So if you watch the YouTube video that I've mentioned here, again, we have places where there are some sort of loud stamps by the dancers, and that's brought out in this music. And of course, the polka originated in Bohemia, and there is some thought among dance choreographers that it probably was coming from a version of the waltz, which might seem rather unusual for us, but they played around with dances. So for structures, I've given you a whole list again, but the exciting thing is in this book, we really get a sonata allegro structure. And this is in Clementi. And I'm so delighted in Mosaics that they've paid attention and have produced versions of these famous sonatinas, but not in the first edition, which we usually get. Because Clementi put this through 5 different editions. And every time he made a new edition, of course, as he says, considerable improvements. And he usually wanted to use more of the pitches that were available on the forte piano as they extended the keyboard, particularly upwards. And so I think that he was doing this, mainly he wanted to sell more of his forte pianos. But it makes it much more interesting that we have more of these upper notes. And so on, way up there. Of course, seeing this in another edition that doesn't have all kinds of phrasing, and we can experiment about how we want to phrase this. My feeling is that we need longer lines like the later classical period, and not break it up with a lot of phrasing. I feel that can all be done as one. So you can experiment with it, what you feel comes across. But what I point out here as real sonata allegro, he moves to a new key by the end of the first section, or in G major, and then he starts the recapitulation, or development, I should say, with a little idea from the exposition. And then, of course, he comes back to the original idea at a very different dynamic level, piano. It's just as if he sneaks into it. And you can also look at page 3031 is one that's fairly close to Sonata Allegro. Now, I want to point out some things in the ornamentation. If we look at page 30 of the Beethoven here, you can see how the Greece notes here have 2 little tails on their so I think they should be done probably here in 60s, because this is early Beethoven. The other interesting thing is we also have a slide over on page 31, bar 28, 29, bar 30. So again, I would put that on the beat. And of course, we also have arpeggios back on the bottom system of the first page. These arpeggios on the beat. I think they have much more effect if you do them on the beat there than if you doing them before. And I suspect that for this early Beethoven, it should be done that way. Rim forzando, I've already mentioned. It occurs on page 32 and 23. So let us quickly move on to Mosaic 4. So in this collection, we have more pieces that show this variety of gestures in rhythms, patterns, and in accompaniments given right for the left hand. Let's look first at the tambourine on page 6. Now, this is a reference to probably the dance that was done in France, and it used a very low-pitched drum. And what Gambarini does here, she uses a murky bass. Now, the murky bass had been around in the Baroque period, but I think she's using it here to really give the idea of that low bass drum. And again, I've given you a YouTube where you can actually listen to this bass drum. With the Duchess of Devonshire reel, we actually have, again, a YouTube video available of the actual reel. And then we have another term that comes up here, and that's the cotillon. And this was referring to the final dance that was usually used by couples in a formation. And so it was actually the forerunner to what we know as the square dance and the quadrille, where of course we usually have callers. So again, I have given you a YouTube video that you can actually see one being performed. This term comes up on page 32. And we have here in the accompaniment straight broken triads with the left hand, a lovely middle section that moves to the minor key of C. And we also have a number of true sonata allegros with exposition, development, and recapitulation in this collection that I'm sure you can work out the structure very readily. I would like to turn to the one that is given by James Hook, page 25, because again, this is one place where you can make a correction in your score. At bar 28, this is at the top of the second page. That should be a D in the right hand there, not an F sharp. So you can make that correction. But this is one that very clearly has our exposition, development, and recapitulation. Exposition. And here you can see already within 6 bars, look at the variety of rhythm patterns we have. So this is a really showing the idea of how classical composers were trying to put a lot of different types of material to reflect these new ideas that had come in philosophy about mankind. Of course, the development section starts at bar 34. Now, I actually agree with the idea that the trill here is a short trill, just really what we would call an upper mordent, although that term hadn't come in quite yet. So I think that is very good. And then our recapitulation starts at bar 46. And we notice that the secondary theme area, which originally had been in our D major, it comes back in G major at bar 63. And here, the grace note I would do as a 16th. Now, I think the other thing I wanted to point out was another use of dolce, which I found very interesting, which is on page 19. Giabelli, here he uses the dolce for the beginning of the recapitulation. So again, in contrast to the original where he has, the idea cantabile, I think you hear, again, you could use maybe flatter fingers. Sort of a little different idea to that, because later on he has, of course, sforzato here in the cadences. So you want to really, again, this mixture of different elements that classical composers were doing in contrasting dynamics, contrasting rhythmic ideas, contrasting melodic gestures. I think it's important in performing classical music that we bring out those contrasts. So if there are any questions about any of these things, perhaps Derek can tell me if something has come in that I should elaborate on.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, I see a couple in the queue here that I'll read out to you in a second. Everyone, just throw your questions in the Q&A, and Elaine will be happy to answer. Before we get to questions, Elaine, can you just introduce your piano? I know it's a Clementi piano, and you've told us about it in the past, but I'm sure a lot of people here today haven't experienced this before. What instrument do you have there?
This is, I guess you can't really see the little nameplate on it, but it says Muzio Clementi and Company, number 26, Cheapside, London. So this was where Clementi had his first pianoforte building company. He had bought it from another maker, and they stayed there for a while, but then the business grew so much they had to have other locations. And so Muzio Clementi, of course, he originally made his name as a composer and a wonderful pianist, but he was playing different types of forte piano when he went on tour in Europe. And of course, there were a lot of developments of forte pianos taking place in London, England. So he got into the piano making business, and it was a very successful business for him. In fact, I have read that at his death, the only other musician around that time that had a greater fortune than Clementi was Rossini. So he did very well in the music business and the music publishing business. Now, on each of his instruments that he made, now of course he made, this is called a cabinet forte piano. So this is more like the instrument that you would have in your home. So like the equivalent of our upright piano, shall we say. But he also made a lot of what we would call wing pianos, and of course they would have more sound because the strings are longer and you have more space. But there's always a number on each Clementi forte piano. So I was able to figure out with a person who has been going around the world trying to find what extant Clementi pianos there are, that this probably dates from early 1802. It might have been made in 1801, very near the end, but it's probably 1802, he told me.
And that one, does it have a knee pedal?
Well, originally it did not. But you probably heard today that I did put the pedal on occasionally. And of course, I was going through Clementi's works, and of course, he started being quite specific about putting in pedal markings, because the foot pedal had been invented in England by Broadwood. So I asked my restorer if it were possible to put a pedal on this instrument, which I think was more or less designed initially because it's very highly decorated. And this, as the person who had been going around and looking at Clementi, but he couldn't get over all the elaborate design that was on this piano in the wood. And so we think that this instrument, because it originally came to me from Jamaica, and that was where the nobleman, the British nobleman that adopted Clementi around the age of 13, he had earned his fortune by running plantations in Jamaica. So we suspect that this instrument was probably made more or less like a piece of furniture to be placed in one of the plantation homes in Jamaica. But my restorer said the innards, shall we say, of the forte piano could support a pedal. Yes, it was just made the same. So he made the foot pedal for me. So I have a foot pedal.
That's marvelous. Okay, so I'll go to a question here from Jono. Many Baroque dance pieces, Bach preludes, etc., move from tonic to dominant and back to the tonic. And Bach often has quite complex modulation through many keys in his music. I'm wondering if Elaine could articulate for us what we see in the classical style that is fundamentally different from the Baroque approach to harmony.
Well, I would say, pardon me, first of all, the idea of using inversions of a chord as being the same chord instead of being different. because when you do it differently, this gave the Baroque composer much more opportunity to put in a lot of chromaticism than when you're sticking with what you're thinking of in your head is the same chord. The other thing is, I feel that the way classical composers set up differences between one key and another key is clarified by their variety of rhythmic structures that they use and the melodic ideas. Whereas in Baroque pieces, when they move to a new key, they tend to keep the same type of gesture that they have had initially. So it's not as clearly separated for me of the new key area, shall we say. I find in Baroque pieces that I feel like I'm shifting through different keys, but they're not placed for me in such a way that they will stand out on their own. So I hope that clarifies it a little bit.
It's almost like in Baroque music, they're just momentary passing modulations that are meant to sort of weave into the overall ornamentation of the style
Exactly.
more seamlessly.
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
This is where I think the sewing machine idea comes from.
That's great. Okay, any other questions here? I'm just looking to see. Does anyone want to raise your hand? Do you have a question for Elaine that you want to speak? I can unmute your microphone. If anyone uses the raise your hand feature, we can do that as well. But feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat box. And Elaine, you went through so thoroughly that I know our audience probably was taking notes with their mosaics book as I was in a few of the cases there. When it comes to ornaments, let's say grace notes specifically, or cacciatura, before or on the beat, you mentioned that date that the first time we see it in print in a treatise is 1822, where now we are performing ornaments ahead of the beat. Is that the sort of one of probably many guidelines you might use?
Absolutely.
Okay. Do you know what treatise that was? Just out of curiosity?
Should have looked up the name.
Yeah.
It isn't on the tip of my tongue. I think I referred to it actually in the earlier one when I did ornamentation. I think I did.
Yeah, I recall this. Yeah, we could look back at the notes there. I think that makes sense.
I can't remember the name. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
He was a theorist. He wasn't one of what I would call the famous theorists, but he did make that observation.
And is it safe to say that back then, by 1822, when we see that published, this has probably been going on for a while already, maybe even a period of years before someone picks up on it, because there's not a lot of travel. There's some travel, but not certainly like we have nowadays.
Now, I feel in playing later Beethoven, there are a lot of places where I feel that before the beat is probably what was used.
Right.
Actually, I think did I forget to mention the slide? Maybe I did. Did I forget to mention the slide? Because
No, you mentioned that one. You did.
Yeah, I did. Okay. And I think there was also, and now I can't remember what piece it was in, but we had the situation of a trill in one of these pieces where the ending is written out, but also the same notes are used before the trill. And in that case, when I was playing with it, I sort of felt that probably those earlier notes were, or could be, I can say that, could be played before the beat. I guess it wasn't before, but let me look if I can find it. I think I forgot to put a little note for that, but
And those of you looking at the handout, I've put a link in the chat box, but I'm going to put the link to the handout as well in the YouTube description so you can download that. When Elaine talks about the YouTube links, there isn't really a link there, but she's written the description of what to type into the YouTube search to generate the performance that she's directing us to. So just keep that in mind as you're looking through the handout there.
yes,
You found it there?
yes, because for some of them there are many different videos available, but I was trying to pick ones which I thought were more clearly defined what the dance was and how it should be done. Yes, I found this trill. It's on page 23 in Mosaics 3, and it's in the Clementi Sonatina, where he has the D, E flat before the trill. Now I think that could be before. And so you have the F's coming together. If you did it, you see, to me, that is rather repetitious because you have first beat, second beat, and you go on with the trill, and then the next bar you also have the D, B flat. And I think it's more interesting to have the F's here. So that's one place where I would suggest that little preamble to the trill be done before the beat.
Right. When we're trying to edit the series, folks, we're trying to put fingerings in that might give you a clue as to what could be acceptable. But as you gather by the conversation, and this happened when we did the ornamentation webinar 2.5 years ago or so, where you encouraged us at times to consider even in Chopin putting the trills on the beat in cases.
Oh, yes.
There's a lot of taste that just happens. What do you think sounds or feels right? Sometimes there's no hard and fast rule.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what I do is I try it different ways. And
Yeah.
what seems to sound more feasible to me, that's what I go with.
Yeah. And again, watch the fingerings will give you clues in the editing, but those aren't hard and fast rules either. There are places where I'm already looking at some of those things we've edited thinking, oh, there are days where I want to do it differently. And that's okay. When students are playing in exams, there are no hard and fast rules. We just want them to understand the style and get them into the idea of what sounds tasteful and understand that this time period, there were no hard and fast rules yet, and certain people did it in different ways in different places.
Mm-hmm. And so that page of the Clementi too, the second last bar has a good example where he has a trill coming from the note below. So this obviously would be on the principal note.
Yeah. But another question here, and I was wondering the same thing a few minutes ago. I don't know why, because I don't have perfect pitch, but is the forte piano at what we consider concert pitch?
No, it's at 415.
So the G sharp would sound like the A. It's a semitone lower. Yeah.
Because that would be the typical tuning that they would use back then. And
right.
Because this is the body of this instrument is all wooden. The only thing that's metal are the pins and the strings. So the wood cannot withstand the
tension.
And tension
that a
high tuning would require.
Right. And that's really how we arrived at 440 eventually, right? Was the idea that we had a metal frame, we could now wrap a lot more tension around that.
Exactly. Because it's several tons in a modern piano.
Yeah, just to go up a semitone, folks. So if you have an old 100-year-old upright and your piano tuner's tuning it and they tell you they can't raise it to pitch because it's too old or whatever, then they're serious. Okay, folks, I think that's all of our questions here that I'm seeing. Thanks for your time and attention. And Dr. Elaine, thanks for putting this all together for us again. I encourage everyone to go check out her former works with us. For those of you that don't know, Dr. Elaine Keillor is a professor emeritus from the University of Ottawa. Is it Ottawa or Carleton? Sorry? Carleton.
Although I'm connected with University of Ottawa too, but it was at Carleton.
So I can never keep it straight. Sorry about that. She's a studio teacher who's retired, but still teaching quite a bit, has a lot of students go through exams and are very successful. She's done a ton of research, has been sending me music over the past few months, especially Canadian music that she's researched over the years so that we could perhaps include it in the Mosaics books coming up in grades 6, 7, 8. So I thank her for that as well. If anyone has any questions for her, just feel free to email me and I'll pass you on to her. Otherwise, Elaine, thanks so much once again. We'll be in touch, and everyone, hope you have a great weekend, and hopefully we'll see you with our discussion next Friday where we'll talk about the state of our teaching studios. So come with your questions prepared, and I look forward to that interactive session. Elaine, is there anything else you wanted to share? Do you have a website still or anything that you upkeep for people?
Um, well, not at this point. I mean,
Yeah.
I have my own website and there are some videos, of course, and many of my selections from the 30 recordings that I put out so far are up on the internet. So if people
Right.
want to explore more, they can.
Okay, super. Thanks, everyone. Elaine, take care of yourself. We'll be in touch. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.